Hey everyone, welcome back to FED Learning. In our last two videos, we explored reusable components and decorators in Angular. Now, let's build on those concepts and dive into one of the most crucial topic in Angular called component communication. Under this topic, we will discuss the different ways to share data between components. First, what is component communication? Component communication is the process by which different components in an Angular application share data, interact, and coordinate with each other. So let's understand why is component communication required in Angular. Component communication is required in Angular because components are isolated, meaning each component has its own isolated scope, which means they don't have direct access to each other's properties or methods. Second, sharing data is necessary. In many cases, components needs to share data or interact with each other to achieve a specific functionality. Next, component communication is necessary for complex application. As applications grow in complexity, components needs to communicate with each other to coordinate their actions and share data. Next, reusability. Component communication enables reusability of components as they can be used in different contexts and communicate with other components. And last, component communication helps to decouple components from each other, making it easier to modify or replace individual components without affecting the entire application. So these are the key reasons why component communication is necessary in Angular. Now, let's explore the different ways to share data between components. And you may encounter this question in an Angular interview. What are the different ways to share data between components in Angular? Then your answer can be in Angular, there are 5 ways to share data between components. First, parent to child, sharing data from parent component to child component via @input decorator. Second, child to parent, sharing data from child component to parent component via @output decorator and event emitter. Third, sibling components, sharing data between siblings via input and output decorators. Fourth, parent to child. In this scenario, a parent component accesses and updates data in a child component, and we will explore how to achieve this using the @viewChild decorator. And last, sharing data between unrelated components via a service. Now, let's understand each concepts one by one along with examples. And as you know, Angular is a component-based architecture, and from Angular 17 onwards, each component is standalone by default. It means each component is independent, and to interact with each component, we need to establish communication between them. Like here, you can see we have a n number of components, and each component is standalone by default. And in Angular, we often communicate between parent and child components. But how do we establish this parent-child relationship between these components? For example, consider we have two components, container and product. And to create a parent-child relationship between them, you just need to insert the product component inside the container component. So by adding the product component inside the container component, we create a parent-child relationship where container component becomes the parent and product component becomes the child. And now we can use the first two methods to share data between the container and product components, or we can say parent and child components. And our first method is parent to child. We can share data from parent component to child component using @input decorator. And we have already explored this concept while learning about reusable components. But we will review this concept with an example under this topic as well. Next, we will explore the second method for sharing data from child component to parent component. And this is the opposite of the first method, where we can share data from child component to the parent component using the @output decorator. Now, let's open Visual Studio Code Editor and implement both approaches. And the first approach is sharing data from parent component to child component. And to demonstrate this approach, I'll create two components, parent and child, using command ng-generate component parent and ng generate component child. And first I'll set up the parent component HTML file. So here I'll take a div with container and text center class. And then I'll add one more div with class row and margin 5. Dot call 12 and then dot text warning. And now I'll add the heading inside this text warning div. And simply I'll add example of first and second. Inside round bracket I'll add the method name parent to child and child to parent. Okay. Now after this div I'll add one more div for new row. And inside this row I'll add two columns, call 6 and then call 5. In between these two columns I'll add one vertical line. For that I'll use class .vr and I'll give padding 0. And inside first column I want to render the content of parent component. So I'll add class text info and inside that I'll add heading h2 parent component. Alt Shift F, format the document. And now inside this second column, to make the child component a child of this parent component, I'll add a child component selector, app child. And you can find this selector inside child component.ts file. Here you can see the selector of child component. So I have already added the child component selector inside parent component template file. And also I need to import the child component inside the parent component's imports array. Here I'll import child component. Okay, so these two steps we need to do to render any component inside other component. First we need to add the selector inside template file and then we need to import the same component inside the imports array. Now inside the child component template file, let's define the basic HTML structure. Div.container dot text center and then I'll add this text info div inside the child component with heading child component. Now let's check in the browser. Okay, to load the component, I'll create a route for a parent component inside app.routes.ts file. Here let me add one more route with path parent and the component for parent path will be parent component. And after that, I'll add a link to the navbar. Here, let me copy paste the link. And here I need to update the path parent and this path for parent atom. Okay. So this will allow us to navigate to the parent component by clicking on the navbar icon. Now save the changes. And when I navigate to the parent component, you can see this heading coming from the parent component template file. Here we have added example 1 and 2. After that, this parent component is also coming from this parent component template file, but this child component is coming from child component template file. So this confirms that our child component is also being rendered in the browser through the parent component. Now, in order to send data from parent component to child component, we need to use the @input decorator. So inside child component class file, let's create an input property called child input property of type string equals to, I'll initialize with an empty string. And now to make this property an input, we need to add the @input decorator prior to this property. And make sure we need to import it from Angular/core. And next, we need to bind this property with the same component template file using string interpolation. So after this div, I'll add one more div with class text warning. And here inside h4, I'll bind our input property, that is child input property. And here I'll add some margin 3. Now save the changes. And this is the first step we need to do in order to share data from parent to child component. We need to create the input property and bind the same property with template file. Now, second step is let's bind the same child input property in the parent component template file inside the child component selector using property binding like this. And this technique is also known as custom property binding. Remember, earlier we studied property binding in the context of data binding, where we bound data to an elements property. However, in this case, we are creating our own custom property. Now, after that, I'll create a local property of parent component class file called parent property of type string equals to, I'll assign it a value such as this is the parent component data. And then I'll assign the value of this parent property to the child input property inside the child component selector. Now save the changes and let's open the browser, and you will see the message displayed inside the child component. And the message is this is the parent component data, but this message is actually coming from the parent component where we define in the class file. And we are passing this data from parent component to the child component using child input property. So I hope you understand this. First, we have declared one input property called child input property inside the child component class file. Then we bound the same property inside the child component template file. And third, we bound the same input property inside parent component template file within the child component selector. And last, assign the value to the parent property to the child input property, which means any data available in the parent property will be assigned to the child input property. That's it. Now, let's move on to the second scenario where we will explore how to send data from child component to parent component. And to send data from child component to parent component, we will use @output decorator along with an event emitter. So inside this child component class file, let's create a new output property called child output property. And since this is the output property, we need to add @output prior to this property. And we need to import this from Angular/core. And we will set it to a new event emitter. Event emitter. This also we need to import from Angular/core of type any. So this is the syntax of output property. We need to write the @output decorator prior to this property and then set this property to a new event emitter. And here, why we are using the event emitter? Because we need to send data from child component to parent component through an event. So for that, first let me add a button inside template file. So below this div, I'll add one more div with class margin 3, and inside this div I'll add one button with class btn success, btn small, and margin 3. And the button name is send data. And after that I'll add a click event to it, and I'll assign one function send data. Means when this button is clicked, it will call this send data function. Now let's define the same function inside class file, and inside this function we will use the emit function on this child output property to send data from child component to parent component. So here I'll call child output property dot emit, and inside this emit we need to provide the value or data which you need to send to parent component. So simply I'll add this is the child component data and save the file. Okay. So what we did inside the child component, we have created an output property inside child component, and then we have created one button, and on click of that button we have called one function, and then we have defined the same function inside the class file of child component, and with the help of event emitter we are sending the data. So since we are sending the event from child component to parent component, we need to catch this event from parent component. And to do this, let me copy this child output property, and I need to add it to the child component selector inside the parent component template file using the event binding. So inside parenthesis, I'll paste this child output property. So here also we are creating custom event similar to this custom property. Now we need to assign this event to a new function called receivedDate and passing $event as a parameter to this function. Okay. Now let's define the same receive data function inside the class file of parent component, and we need to pass parameter of type any or string, and inside this receive data function we will assign this data to a local variable. So before that, let me create the local variable called receive message of type string. And now I'll assign this data to the receive message property. Okay. And last, to display this message in the browser, I'll bind this receive message variable to the parent component template file. So below this parent component div, I'll add one more div with class text warning and margin 3. And inside h4, inside string interpolation, I'll paste this receive message parent property. Now save the changes and let me open the browser. When I click the send data button, you can see the message from the child component displayed inside the parent component. Let me refresh the page and click on send data button, and we can see the message. This is the child component data inside parent component. Okay. So this is how the @output decorator works in Angular, allowing components to communicate with each other by emitting events. I'll quickly recap. We have created an output property inside the child component, and when the button was clicked, it emitted the required data. After that, in the parent component, we caught the event using event binding and passed the data to the function. And then we have stored the data inside local variable called receivedDate and display it in the browser through parent component template file. And with this, we have completed the first two scenario, sharing data from parent to child as well as from child to parent. Now let me switch back to presentation and explore the third method of sharing data called sibling components. This method combines the first two approaches using both the input and output decorators. This allows sibling components to share data in both directions. For example, let me add the pointer here and consider two components, child 1 and child 2, that wants to share data. And the common link between them is their parent component. So to share data from child 1 component to child 2 component, first child 1 component send data to the parent component through an event using @output decorator. Then parent component sends the same data to the child 2 component using the @input decorator. And similarly, to share data from child 2 component to child 1 component, the same process occurs with child 2 component. So in this case, child 2 component sends data to the parent component through an event using @output decorator, and then parent component sends the same data to the child 1 component using the @input decorator. So in this approach, sibling components share data with each other through a common parent component using @input and @output decorators. So let's try this out as well. And to demonstrate this, how sibling components communicate, I'll create two more components called sibling1 and sibling2 using command ng generate component. Okay, Control C. And now I'll hit command ng generate component name sibling1 and sibling2. Now, to make these two components sibling, I'll add them inside the parent component. So inside imports array, I'll import these two sibling components, sibling1 and sibling2. And then inside template file of parent component, I'll copy this row, first row, and paste it below this line number 23. And here I'll update the heading example of 3 sibling components. Okay, and after this div, I'll add one more div with new row. And here I'll again take call 6 and then call 5. And inside this, I'll add one vertical line with padding 0. And then inside this first call 6, I'll add the selector of sibling1 component. And inside this call 5 div, I'll add the selector of sibling2 component. Now let me open the browser. And here you can see the sibling1 components rendered in the first column and sibling2 components rendered in the second column. And by doing this, sibling1 and sibling2 are sibling components as well as children of the parent component. So now let's try to share data between sibling1 and sibling2 through the parent component. And as we have already learned, we can share data from child component to its parent using the @output decorator and an event emitter. So first we will send data from sibling1 to sibling2. For that, let me open the sibling1 component template file and class file. And inside sibling1 class file, let's create an output property. And remember, @input and @output properties are always created inside the child component, not in the parent component. Here you can see we have already shared data between parent and child, but we didn't add any input and output decorator inside parent component. We have added the property decorators inside child component class file only. Here you can see. So it means the input and output property decorators are always created inside the child component. So inside this sibling1 component, let me create one output property called sibling1 event equals to new event emitter, import from Angular/core of type any. We need to import this output as well from Angular/core. And now to send data through an event, we need to add a button inside sibling1 components template file. So let me copy the child component template file and let me paste it inside the sibling1 component. And now I'll update the text like heading sibling1 component. And then for now I don't need this and I need a button. So I'll change the button name to submit. And when submit button is clicked, this will trigger the click event. Okay. And here I'll add one input box and I'll provide the ID to this input box like sibling1. And now when the submit button is clicked, it will call the onSubmit function. So here let me change the function name to onSubmit and which will get the value from this input box. So I'll pass the parameter id.value and id is sibling1. It means we can type any data inside this input box and we will retrieve it using id.value. Okay. So next, inside TypeScript file, I'll define this onSubmit function, which takes a parameter data of type any. And inside this onSubmit function, I'll use the output property to emit the data. Sibling1 event dot emit, and inside this emit we need to pass the data. Okay, so from this sibling1 component we are sending data to parent component through an event. So inside parent component template file we need to capture the event triggered by sibling1 component, and to do this we will use event binding. So let me copy this output property and paste it inside the sibling1 component select. And we need to bind this sibling1 event to a local function of parent component. So let's say receive event 1, and inside round bracket we need to pass $event, and this function will be called when the event is triggered. Now let's define this receive event 1 function inside the parent component class file with parameter data of type any, and inside this function we need to assign this data to a local variable. So let's create a local variable sibling1 data of type string or any, and inside this function I'll assign this data to the sibling1 data variable. And after that I'll log this sibling1 data inside console.log, and I'll test inside console we are receiving data correctly or not. So let me clear the console, and here if I type test message and if I click on the submit button, we can see the same message stored in the sibling1 data variable. So this means we have successfully sent data from sibling1 component to the parent component. Now next, we will send this data from the parent component to the another sibling2 component using @input decorator. And since sibling2 component is the another child of parent component, we will create an input property inside the sibling2 component and then send data from parent component using property binding. So now let me open the sibling2 component class file as well as the template file. And inside class file, first I'll create the input property @input round bracket, and we need to import this input decorator from Angular/code. And the input property name is sibling2 property of type string equals to empty string. Now let's bind this sibling2 property to the template file of the sibling2 components. Before that, let me copy paste the structure of template component from sibling1 template file to the sibling2 template file. Here, let me update the title. This is sibling2 component, and here I'll comment out this div and uncomment this div, because inside this h4 tag we need to bind this sibling2 property. Okay, so what we did, we have created an input property inside class file of sibling2 component, and same property we have bound inside the template file of same sibling2 component. Now let me copy this sibling2 property and go back to the parent component template file, and we will bind the sibling2 property inside the sibling2 component selector using property binding, and we will assign the value of sibling2 property to the local variable in the parent component, and which already stores the data received from sibling1 component called sibling1 data variable. So let me copy this and assign it to the value of this sibling2 property. So this means we are assigning the data from sibling1 to sibling2 inside the parent component. And since we have already bound this sibling2 property inside this sibling2 component template file, any message sent from sibling1 component will be displayed inside the sibling2 component. So let's see the result in the browser. I'll send some test data from this sibling1 component. Hello, sibling1. And now I'll click on submit button. And as you can see here, inside sibling2 component, we are receiving the same data. So far, we have achieved the sibling component communication by first sending data from the sibling1 component to the parent using @output decorator, and then from the parent component to the sibling2 component using the @input decorator. Now let's repeat the same process to send data from the sibling2 component to the sibling1 component. So first we will send data from sibling2 component to parent component using @output decorator. So to start, I'll create here output property called sibling2 event equals to new event emitter of type any, and we need to import this output decorator. O must be capital. Okay, so this output property will allow sibling2 component to emit an event and send data to the parent component. So next, inside template file of the same sibling2 component, I'll uncomment this div, and here let me update the ID sibling2. Here I'll change the button name to send, and the function will be on send. And here we need to pass the sibling2 dot value as a parameter to this function. Now let's define the same function inside the TS file with parameter data of type any, and inside this function we need to emit the data. So sibling2 event dot emit data. So this function will be triggered when the send button is clicked, and it will use the event emitter to emit the data entered in the input box. And now next step is to capture the event emitted by the sibling2 component inside the parent component template file. And to do this, I'll bind the sibling2 event inside the sibling2 component selector using event binding. And I'll assign this event with local function in the parent component called receive event 2. And inside parenthesis, I need to pass the $event. Now let's define the same function inside the class file of parent component. Here I'll pass parameter same data of type any, and I'll create one more local variable with name sibling2 data. And now I'll pass this data to sibling2 data variable. Okay. So now the parent component has received data from the sibling1 and sibling2 components. Let's send this sibling2 data to the sibling1 component. So for that, inside sibling1 component, we need to create an input property inside the class file. So here, let me create an input property @input space sibling1 property of type string equals to empty string. Let me import this input property, and now we need to bind this sibling1 property to the template file of sibling1 component using string interpolation. So here I'll paste the sibling1 property. Now finally, inside the parent component template file, I'll bind the sibling1 property inside sibling1 selector using property binding. And I'll assign its value to the parent component's local variable called sibling2 data, which holds the data from sibling2 component. So let me paste this property here. And with this, we have set up the communication between the sibling1 and sibling2 components. Now let's test this third scenario end to end. First, I'll send from sibling1 component. Let's say greeting from sibling1, and I'll click on the submit button. We are receiving the data inside sibling2 component. Now let me send the different data from sibling2 component, like greeting from sibling2. And now I'll click on the send button, and we are receiving the same data inside sibling1 component. It means we have successfully sent data from both sibling1 and sibling2 components and received them in the other sibling component. And this demonstrates a successful implementation of inter-component communication. So with this, we have covered the third approach to sharing data between sibling components. Now, let's move on to the another approach to sharing data between components. Let me go back to the PPT. And the fourth approach is sharing data from parent to child via @viewChild decorator. So in this section, we will explore how to update a child component data from a parent component using the @viewChild decorator. And we have two options to update the child component data from the parent component, such as @input decorator or a viewChild decorator. But it's important to know the difference between them. The @input decorator allows you to pass data from the parent component to the child component. On the other hand, the viewChild decorator enables you to update a child component's data directly from the parent component. And we have already covered the @input decorator. Now let's focus on using the @viewChild decorator. So what is viewChild? ViewChild is again a decorator in Angular that allows a parent component to access and manipulate a child component properties and methods. Or in other words, it is a property decorator that is used to get a reference to a child component or an element within a parent component. Now let's go back to Visual Studio Code Editor and try to understand how the ViewChild decorator works. And to demonstrate this, I'll add the reusable component inside the parent component. So let me copy paste the same div and I'll just reduce this margin to 2. This also 2. And now I'll paste this div here with margin 2. And I'll update the heading. This is the example of fourth scenario. Parent to child using ViewChild. Okay. Now after this div, I'll take one more div with row margin 2, and inside this, I'll add the reusable component selector, app reusable. And then I need to import the reusable component inside imports array of the parent component class file. Reusable component. Okay. Now let me open the reusable component class file as well as the HTML file. Okay. Now, to access the reusable component inside the parent component class file, we need to add a template reference variable to the reusable component selector. So with the help of hash symbol, we can add a template reference variable. So I'll write reusable. Now, with the help of this template reference variable, we can access this template inside the class file. So inside parent component class file, here, I'll import the ViewChild decorator from Angular/core package. And now I'll use this to access the HTML element of the same component. So let me write @viewChild, and inside round bracket, we need to provide the template reference variable that is reusable inside single quotes. Then create a local variable reusable component of type reusable component. Okay. So here I have created a local variable called reusable comp of type reusable component. And I have already imported this view child. Still I am getting error. Okay. Here V must be capital. Okay. Now with the help of this reusable comp variable, we can access this HTML element. It means we can access the reusable component using this local variable reusable comp. And to load the ViewChild related data in the browser, we should use the ng after view init lifecycle hook. So let me implement this hook first. Implements after view init. And then we need to define this hook, ng after view init. So why we need this hook in order to render this ViewChild related data? Because this ng after view init is called once the entire application is initialized in the browser. Okay, so inside this ng after view init, we can update the reusable components property. So let me access the reusable component using local variable reusable comp. dot. As you can see here, we can now access the child property as well as on-click method of the reusable component from the parent component. And if you go inside the reusable component class file, you can see one child property and one on-click method. So it means from parent component using viewChild decorator, we can access all the properties and methods of child component. So as of now, let me access the child property and I want to update this property with message greeting from parent component. Okay, so only this code we need to add inside the parent component class file, and inside reusable component we don't need to make any changes because we have accessed it from the parent component and modified the existing property. Therefore, no additional coding is required inside the child component. Now let's open the browser and we are getting an error, incomplete block view child. If you meant to write at the rate character, you should use okay. Inside the HTML file, we cannot write this at the rate symbol directly. Okay, now save the changes and we can see the alert box with updated message greeting from parent component. Let me comment out this message and you can see the previous message, hello all, welcome to FAD learning, which we have added inside this reusable component. But I can update this message from the parent component using viewChild decorator, greeting from the parent component. Okay, so how the viewChild decorator works in Angular? The parent component uses the viewChild decorator to access the child component. And this decorator takes the child component's template reference variable as an argument, allowing the parent to reference and interact with the child component. And this template reference variable we have added to this child component selector. And then parent component can access the child component properties and methods using the viewChild property. And last, parent component can share data with the child component by updating its properties or calling its methods. Therefore, when to use viewChild decorator in Angular, you can use viewChild decorator in two scenarios. First, to access the child component data inside the parent component, and second, to access the template element within the same component class file. Okay. And what is the difference between @viewChild and @input decorator? Both are the property decorators, but the viewChild decorator allows a parent component to access and update a child component's properties or method. In contrast, the @input decorator enables a parent component pass data to the child component. So to share data from parent component to child component, we can use @input decorator. And to update the child component data from the parent component, we can use viewChild decorator. Now last, let's discuss how to share data between unrelated components. This means sharing data between components that don't have a parent-child relationship. And as we have covered earlier in this series, the solution is to use shared service. This allows us to share data between unrelated components using a common service. And to do this, first we need to create a service that holds a shared data. Then we need to inject the service into the components that need to share data through their constructor. And then component can access and update the shared data through the service. And I'm not going to cover the example of service here because we have already covered this in our previous topics. But if you are new to this series, then I'll recommend checking out my previous topics on dependency injection, CRUD operations, and resource API to understand more about services. Okay, so with this, we have covered the component communication in Angular with practical examples. And I hope you now have a clear understanding of this concept. So that's all for now. And if you enjoyed this content, kindly do like, share, and leave a comment in the description below. We will meet again in the next video. Until then, keep learning and keep visiting. Thank you. Bye bye.